great to be here. What a great name for a place like this, 1776, where revolutions begin. I mean, yes, what you have built here, what you and Brandon have built here, Donna, is something that's near and dear to my heart. I love history, and I love technology. So a U.S. history-themed technology incubator. I'm in heaven. It's as if I designed my own amusement park. But thank you very much for hosting us today. And I do want to comment that I got a email earlier this morning from my friend Jason Green, who said, "Work me into your remarks." He's here at the part of this. "Work me into your remarks and you get extra points." I just did, Jason. But, revolutionary technological ideas like those that are developing here at 1776 are coming at us at a never-before-seen pace, all because of the internet. Our economic future is inexorably tied to the continued expansion of the internet. And that's why today I've come here to address an essential key to that future: the state of broadband competition. More specifically, I'd like to address how the growing bandwidth demands of businesses and consumers are changing the competitive broadband landscape. My goal is not to criticize, but to recognize that meaningful competition for high-speed wired broadband is lacking, and that Americans need more competitive choices for faster and better internet connections, both to take advantage of today's new services and to incentivize the kinds of things that happen here at 1776, tomorrow's innovative new services. At the beginning of my term at the FCC, I spoke about what I called the Network Compact, the immutable values that consumers have a right to expect from their network providers, such as access, interconnection, public safety, national security, consumer protection. The goal of public policy should be to protect the Network Compact across all aspects of telecommunications. And in a similar vein, there should be an agenda for broadband competition that establishes principles for all of our broadband activities. I say principles because they should be broad enough to reach across all the specific broadband policy issues, yet clear enough to be a roadmap. The underpinning of broadband policy today is that competition is the most effective tool for driving innovation, investment, and consumer and economic benefits. Unfortunately, the reality that we face today is that as bandwidth increases, competitive choices decrease. Take a look at this chart. This is a chart of various bandwidth speeds and the level of competition. And the key is the lighter the blue, the less competition. The bar on the left reflects the availability of wired broadband using the FCC's current broadband definition of 4 megabits per second. But let's be clear, that's yesterday's broadband. 4 megabits per second isn't adequate when a single HD video delivered to home or classroom takes 5 meg. This is why we've proposed updating the broadband speed required for universal service support to 10 meg. But even 10 meg doesn't fully capture the increasing demand for better broadband, of which downstream speed, of course, is only one component. It's not uncommon for a U.S. Internet connected household to have a half a dozen or more connected devices: televisions, desktops, laptops, tablets, smartphones, and then you go on to the connected house from there. When these devices are used at the same time, as they often are in the evenings, it's not hard to overwhelm 10 megabits of bandwidth. And consumer demand is growing. Today, over 60% of peak time downloads are streaming audio and video. While today that video may be entertainment, other applications are right behind. For instance, if we are to tackle the healthcare cost challenge, high-speed broadband video for remote examination, diagnostics, and even surgery is important. If our students are to get a 21st century education, high-speed broadband to the classroom and to their desk is essential. And increasingly, that high speed will be in both directions. As is proved daily here at 1776, high-speed broadband connections are crucial not only for the kind of innovation that will educate our children and deliver quality health care, but also to improve energy efficiency, fill the employment ranks, and maintain the United States as the world's innovation leader for the 21st century. The history of our time will be recorded as a period in which ever-increasing network performance made possible an ever-expanding list of capabilities for both consumers and businesses. This is the virtuous cycle. The better the available broadband performance, the more that edge providers will take advantage of that performance with new applications, which in turn will drive more investment to meet the demand for next generation services. It's a virtuous cycle. And that's why our focus cannot be on only the left half of this chart. At 25 megabits per second, that kind of a connection, the third graph there, the third bar there, we should consider table stakes for the 21st century. Today about 80% of American homes have access to a broadband connection that delivers 25 megs or better. But we need to keep moving to the right of this chart. We will continue as an agency to establish requirements for our universal service programs. But beyond that, consumers are establishing their own expectations. Today, a majority of American homes have access to 50 or even 100 megabits per second. It's the kind of bandwidth that we need if we're to take advantage of 21st century opportunities. And while it's good that a majority of American homes have access to 100 meg, it's not acceptable that over 40% of Americans do not. But, and this is a very big but, just because most Americans have access to next-generation broadband doesn't mean that they have competitive choices. Here at 1776, it's good to recall our history. It was the absence of competition that historically forced the imposition of strict government regulation to telecommunications. One of the consequences of such a regulated monopoly was the thwarting of the kind of innovation that competition stimulates. Today we are buffeted by constant innovation, precisely because of the policy decisions that were made by the FCC and the Justice Department in the 1970s and 1980s to promote competition. The path from narrowband to broadband to high-speed broadband was forged by competition. In order to meet the competitive threat of satellite services, cable TV companies upgraded their facilities. And when the internet went mainstream, they found themselves in the enviable position of having greater network capacity than the telephone company. Confronted by such competition, the telephone companies upgraded to DSL, and in some places deployed all fiber and copper networks. Cable companies then responded further by improving their own broadband performance. All of this investment is a really good thing. But the simple lesson of history is that competition drives deployment and network innovation. That was true yesterday, and it'll be true tomorrow. Our challenge is to keep that competition alive and growing. Today, cable companies provide the overwhelming percentage of high-speed broadband connections to America. Industry observers believe that cable's advantage over DSL will continue for the foreseeable future. The question with which we as Americans must wrestle is whether broadband will continue to be responsive to competitive forces in order to produce the advances that consumers and our economy increasingly demand. Now, we've seen what happens when companies like Google bring new competition in the form of gigabit service to cities like Kansas City and Austin. In Kansas City, the cable company responded with its own upgrade to gigabit service. And in Austin, the telephone company responded to upgrade competitively with its own ultra-high-speed service. In fact, AT&T has announced plans to deploy gigabit fiber to 21 major metropolitan markets. Many of these are in the same markets where Google has announced its plans to lay fiber. A year ago, Cox Cable said that it wouldn't be upgrading to gigabit networks because it would cost billions of dollars. Now it says it will, starting with communities where Google and CenturyLink are deploying fiber themselves. This is all great news. We applaud the investment by incumbents and new entrants alike that have brought better broadband to Americans. Clearly, the infrastructure companies are voting with their checkbooks to say that competition and investment not only can coexist, but also they can drive each other to produce both profit and progress. I'm hopeful that this growth in competitive, high-speed broadband will continue. These gigabit developments are positive, but they're not yet pervasive. Looking across the broadband landscape, we can only conclude that while competition has driven broadband deployment, it has not yet done so in a way that necessarily provides competitive choices for most Americans. Take a look at the chart again. At the low end throughput, 4 megabits and 10 megabits, the majority of Americans have a choice of only two providers. That's what economists call a duopoly, a marketplace that is typically characterized by less than vibrant competition. But even two competitors overstates the case. Counting the number of choices that a consumer has on the day before their internet service is installed does not measure their competitive alternatives on the day after. Once consumers choose a broadband provider, they face switching costs that include early termination fees, equipment rental fees, and other barriers. And if those disincentives to competition weren't enough, the media is full of stories about consumers' struggles to get ISPs to allow them to drop their service. It was precisely that kind of analysis of switching costs that the Commission adopted in its 2010 Open Internet Order, and that the FCC and that the D.C. Circuit affirmed in its decision in the Verizon case. In upholding the Commission's authority to maintain an open internet in order to limit the gatekeeper power of broadband ISPs, the D.C. Circuit affirmed these competitive realities and observed, quote, if end users could immediately respond to any given broadband provider's attempt to impose restrictions on edge providers by switching broadband providers, this gatekeeper power might well disappear, unquote. But users cannot respond by easily switching providers. As a result, even though there may be competition, the market may not be offering consumers competitive opportunities to change providers, especially once they've signed up with a provider in the first place. Some of you are old enough, like me. Now, I really question this line. Some of you are old enough as I look out over this crowd, So there's a couple of you in this crowd who are old enough, like me, to remember the long-distance telephone wars of the 1990s. Sign up with Sprint in April, switch to MCI in May, then to AT&T in June, choose one of them or somebody else again in July. That's what a truly competitive telecommunications marketplace looks like. And that's not the reality, even for competitive broadband today. Focus on the chart again. At 25 megabits, that's the third bar, at 25 megabits, there is simply no competitive choice for most Americans. Stop and let that sink in. Do the math, adding those top two up. 3/4 of American homes have no competitive choice for the essential infrastructure for 21st century economics and democracy. Included in that is that almost 20% have no choice at all. Things only get worse when you move to 50 megabits, where 82% of consumers lack a choice. It's important to understand the technological limitations of the twisted pair copper plant on which telephone companies have relied for their DSL connections. Traditional DSL is just not keeping up. And new DSL technologies, while helpful, are limited to short distances. Increasing copper's capacity may help in clustered business parks and downtown buildings. But the signal's rapid degradation over distance may limit the improvement's practical ability to change the overall competitive landscape. We have great hopes for wireless as a potential substitute for fixed broadband connections. But today it seems clear that mobile broadband is just not a full substitute for fixed broadband, especially when given mobile pricing levels and limited data allowances. And while LTE and LTE Advanced offer new potential, consumers have yet to see how these technologies will be used to deliver fixed wireless service. We welcome and we must encourage the development of new technologies that can bring greater competition and more choices to consumers. In the end, at this moment, however, only fiber gives the local cable company a competitive run for its money. Once fiber is in place, its beauty is that throughput increases are largely a matter of upgrading the electronics at both ends, something that costs much less than laying new connections. But hidden in this chart lies a further concern. Americans living in urban areas are 3 times more likely to have access to high-speed broadband than Americans living in rural areas. As bandwidth needs increase, we cannot tolerate the broadband digital divide getting wider. Let's return to look at history one more time. Communications policy has always agreed on one important concept: the exercise of uncontrolled last-mile power is not in the public interest. And that reality has not changed as a result of new technology. When network operators have unrestrained last-mile power, public policy can step in to protect consumers and innovators. When cable companies, for instance, were accused of using their control over last-mile distribution of video programming to harm competition by keeping content from others, the Congress stopped that practice with the 1992 Cable Act. There are 2 important lessons from this. First, last-mile power cannot be a lever for gaining an unfair advantage. And second, rules of the road can provide guidance for all players. And by restraining future actions that would harm the public interest, such rules of the road can incent more investment and more innovation. Now, all of this raises the question, what's the FCC prepared to do in the face of this competitive reality that I've just laid out? As must be clear by now, incentivizing competition should precede regulation. We must try our best, both companies and communities, incumbents and insurgents, to foster more competition. The best answer for limited competition is more competition, plain and simple. There's no doubt that regulation, even when necessary, imposes costs. Especially in a fast-moving sector, it is important that companies be free to develop better networks and to attract the investment necessary to do so. Yet let's remember that no company should be held immune from competition that drives investment. And at the same time, no company should be protected from public interest obligations, especially where meaningful competition is not present. So what can we do? At the outset of these remarks, I mentioned an agenda for broadband competition. Like the Network Compact, it is a set of policy goals that are broadly and continually applicable as technology and the marketplace evolve. And let me tick through 4 components of that agenda. 1, where competition exists, the Commission will protect it. Our effort opposing shrinking the number of nationwide wireless providers from 4 to 3 is an example of that. As applied to fixed networks, the Commission's order on tech transition experiments similarly starts with the belief that changes in network technology should not be a license to limit competition. Second, where greater competition can exist, we will encourage it. Again, a good example comes from wireless broadband. The reserve spectrum in the broadcast incentive auction will provide opportunities for wireless providers to gain access to important low-band spectrum that could enhance their ability to compete. Similarly, the entire open internet proceeding is about ensuring that the internet remains free from barriers erected by last-mile providers. Third, where meaningful competition is not available, the Commission will work to create it. For instance, our efforts to improve and expand the amount of unlicensed spectrum creates alternative, competitive pathways. And we understand the petitions from 2 communities asking us to preempt state laws against citizen-driven broadband expansion to be in the same category, which is why we are looking so carefully right now at those petitions. Incentivizing competition is a job for government at all levels. We must build on and expand the creative thinking that has gone into facilitating advanced broadband builds across the country. For example, Google Fiber's City Checklist highlights the importance of timely and accurate information about and access to infrastructure, such as poles and conduits. Working together, we can implement policies at the federal, state, and local level that serve consumers by facilitating construction and encouraging competition in the broadband marketplace. Fourth, where competition cannot be expected to exist, we must shoulder the responsibility of promoting the deployment of broadband. One thing we already know is the fact that something works in New York City doesn't mean that it works in rural South Dakota. We cannot allow rural America to be behind the broadband curve. Our universal service efforts are focused on bringing better broadband to rural America by whomever steps up to the challenge. Not all the highest speeds at once, but steadily to prevent creation of a new digital divide. So the examples of applying the agenda for broadband competition that I've just listed are spread across many policy areas. This agenda is a set of concise, overriding principles capable of leaping traditional categories. The work of the Commission is to implement this agenda, and that work will never be done. New technologies, innovation, and market developments will continually redefine the reality of broadband service. Our goal is that whatever the new realities may be, competition must be the North Star. Since my first day as chairman of the FCC, my mantra has been consistent and concise. Competition, competition, competition. Or, as it is more frequently expressed, competition, competition, competition. As we've seen today, there is an inverse relationship between competition and the kind of broadband performance that consumers are increasingly demanding. This is not tolerable. Our challenge, and by our, I mean both industry and government, is to do everything in our power to ensure that the United States has the world's most dynamic and competitive broadband ecosystem with a virtuous cycle of new investment, new innovation, and new services. It's a lofty goal, but I have no doubt that it is achievable. Hey, this is the country that invented the internet. As is being proved right here at 1776. The future starts in the United States of America. And that future is built on high-speed, competitive, broadband choice for all Americans, both consumers and companies. By all of our actions, again, both industry and government, we must demonstrate that we are all dedicated to this purpose. Thank you very much for coming. Donna and Brandon, thank you very much for your hospitality. It's great to be here. Thank you.